Hello, and welcome to the podcast Justice Unbound, about women, religion, and the State of Israel. In this podcast, we take you behind the closed doors of Israeli rabbinic courts, where all hearings are held in camera, closed to the public, and where the state applies religious laws to decide the fate of women trapped in marital captivity, agunot, of children stigmatized because of their mother's sexual partners, mamzerim, of converts who did not keep the Sabbath, and where citizens are cross-examined about whether they are Jewish enough, and much, much more. Justice Unbound is written and produced by the Center for Women's Justice, CWJ, and I'm your host, Susan Weiss.
And I'm your host, Rivkah. Today we have a very important topic to talk about, chalitza. And I think, Susan, that we want to devote 2 episodes to this topic so that our listeners will really be able to understand what chalitza is and how it affects women to this very day with regard to their personal status, their social status, and their finances.
Yep, absolutely. So here's the plan. Rivkah will begin by explaining the Jewish laws of yibum and chalitza. Yibum in English is translated as levirate marriage. Chalitza can be translated as the release of a woman from her levirate marriage. So what we hope to accomplish is to explain to you, our listeners, how yibum and chalitza operate under Jewish law, and in particular, we want you to understand how it works in Israel today, or for that matter, all over the world. We will describe the problems that yibum and chalitza present for Jewish women, and in the process, we will relate some of our true-life horror stories. Next time, we will talk more specifically about the war going on right now, which we pray will be over by the time this episode comes out. In the second episode, we will be describing in more detail how recent Jewish war widows confront the challenges of yibum and chalitza, and then we will discuss what we at CWJ, the Center for Women's Justice, are doing about it.
Right. So I'll start off by explaining what yibum and chalitza are. So if a man dies without children, without any offspring, biblical law requires that the man's brother take the widow in marriage. The idea behind this law is to ensure that the name of the dead husband is not lost. The Bible explains that the purpose of the law is to produce an heir who will perpetuate the name of the husband so that his name will not, quote, be blotted out of Israel, end of quote. In fact, the first child of the widow and her husband's brother is considered to be the child of the dead husband. It's important to mention that generally, biblical law forbids a woman to have sexual relations with her brother-in-law, and that's the case even after the husband has died. Only when the marriage has not produced any children and the husband has no offspring from before is the wife permitted and even obligated, according to the Bible, to marry her husband's brother. Marrying the husband's brother, being taken by him, that is, having sexual relations with him, is called yibum. In English, this is called a levirate marriage. If the brother refuses to take the widow as a wife, the Bible instructs the brother to renounce his levirate marriage obligation and thereby release the widow from any obligation to marry him and to enable her to marry someone else. The renunciation is done in a symbolic ceremony, which involves the widow removing a sandal or shoe from the brother's foot, spitting at him and rebuking him for not taking her as his wife. So, in biblical times, you either did yibum or chalitza. Either the brother married the widow, yibum, or he refused to marry her and cut any legal connection to her through the sandal shoe ceremony, chalitza. Then both parties were free to go their own way.
Rivkah, I don't know of any modern case in which a man married his sister-in-law just because his brother had died. In other words, I know of no case of yibum.
Okay, that's true. At some point, the rabbis didn't like the idea of yibum, levirate marriage, and they argued among themselves about whether it was preferable to do yibum, levirate marriage, or actually to go straight to chalitza, the renunciation ceremony. And when I say they argued among themselves, I mean this took place for many, many years when they couldn't decide on this. Anyway, the rabbis felt that brothers were marrying the widows for the wrong reasons. Sometimes the brothers were already married, and the rabbis didn't think it was okay for them to take another wife. Sometimes the rabbis thought that the levirate marriage was inappropriate because of the age difference between the brother and the widow. Basically, the rabbis understood that the brother usually wasn't interested in perpetuating his dead brother's name, but instead just wanted to inherit his property. When you get the widow, you get the property that goes with her. As a rule, Ashkenazi rabbis recommended to stop yibum, levirate marriage, and they only allowed chalitza, the renunciation ceremony. But the Sephardi rabbis required yibum, mainly because it was customary in the Sephardi communities to marry more than one woman. I would also add that this may reflect women's status in general. I would say that in communities where the widow was given to the brother of the deceased, her status wasn't too great. Since 1950, the Chief Rabbinate of Israel has prohibited yibum, levirate marriage, and it's declared that yibum should not take place at all. And it only permits chalitza, the renunciation ceremony.
What if the widow marries someone else or lives with another man without doing the ceremony? What happens?
Okay, so Jewish law doesn't allow the widow to marry any other man before she gets freed from the halachic obligation that she has to her husband's brother. What we need to understand is that, in fact, until the ritual of chalitza is performed, the widow is considered zikukat yibum or zikukat chalitza, which means in need of chalitza or tied to chalitza. In other words, from the moment of the husband's death, if there is no offspring of the husband, Jewish law creates a legal bond and connection between the widow and her husband's brothers that must be dissolved in order to permit her to be free to marry another man.
Rivkah, I see this as a kind of constructive betrothal. The law immediately constructs a situation in which the widow is betrothed to her husband's brother, or brothers actually, as you informed me, and is in need of a kind of a get. She becomes a kind of aguna, a woman held in marital captivity, or perhaps more accurately, betrothal captivity. So tell us what happens if the widow does not marry anyone else, but just lives with another man and has a child.
Yeah, so it's important to note that in such a case, Jewish law does not consider the children who may be born later to be mamzerim, even if the widow did not do chalitza. Though, like you said, in other ways, the widow is still very much like a married woman. Like a married woman, the widow cannot marry anyone else until she is released from the bonds that tie her to a man, in this case, her husband's brother. After one of the brothers releases her, the widow is like a divorced woman who received a get, and she's prohibited from marrying a Kohen. Remember, if she were just a widow with children, meaning that she did not need chalitza, she would be allowed to marry a Kohen.
Wow, Rivkah, I did not know this until we began preparing this podcast, and I've been in this business for a very long time. I must say, for me, this is just another bad law that works against Jewish women.
I think that yibum probably benefited women in the past, as we can understand from the case of Ruth and Boaz. A woman who became a young widow was in a terrible situation socially and economically and needed a man in her life. This was a way of protecting her, I think. But I agree that today the whole idea of the widow being connected and tied to the husband's family is quite strange to us and hurts women in various ways. As you suggested, the main problem with chalitza is understanding that under halacha, a woman isn't free to go and start another family after her husband's death, and that's only because he didn't have any children. So this dependency upon the brother or brothers causes problems that we are familiar with from our aguna cases. Like a husband, the brother can refuse to cooperate with the widow and extort her in exchange for his cooperation. And if a brother is unable for various reasons to undergo the chalitza ceremony, the widow, like the aguna, is stuck. She can't marry someone else.
Rivkah, we know of a recent case that illustrates this all too well. It was published in the latest issue of Hadin V'Dayan, a legal journal published by Bar Ilan University. I think it's in the Din V'Dayan, the law and its decisor, number 67.
Yes, so the case involved a young widow who asked the Petach Tikva Rabbinic Court for help in obtaining chalitza. She'd been married very shortly to a man who died in 2023 from an illness. The man had been fighting with his father, and after the man died, the father decided to take his revenge. He told the brother, the one who was supposed to do the chalitza, not to cooperate with the chalitza ritual. In order to buy her freedom, the widow agreed to her father-in-law's demands that she give up any money or property that was due to her under the inheritance laws. But this wasn't good enough for the father-in-law, and he still didn't allow the brother, that is his son, to do chalitza. The rabbinic judges, frustrated that the case wasn't ending, decided to impose penalties on the father-in-law. They declared that the father-in-law had to pay 5,000 shekel a week till he allowed the son to do chalitza. The Beit Din also threatened to imprison the father-in-law. Only after both those threats did the father relent and allow his son to perform the chalitza ceremony, which released the widow. And all this happened, Susan, in 2023 and 2024. It's not like this is a zillion years ago. So look what people are coping with today.
Wow, Rivkah, this decision does not work for me on so many levels. I am not impressed with the decision at all. First, there is the matter of extortion. The rabbinic court writes specifically, and I quote, that it agreed with the father-in-law's demand that he inherit all of his son's property in accordance with Din Torah, the law of the Torah. That is, they implied that this was what Din Torah would have required. What? How could the Beit Din cooperate with extortion? And second, I am having a hard time understanding why the rabbis don't simply repeal Yibum, the levirate marriage, completely, instead of requiring renunciation, the chalitza ceremony. Yibum is a very bad law for women, and everyone knows it. Requiring chalitza just serves to perpetuate the bad law of Yibum.
Well, at least the rabbinic court did resolve the conflict, and the widow was able to get on with her life. But, Susan, there are more difficult cases which cannot be resolved by negotiation, extortion, or fines. There are situations in which it's impossible to perform the ceremony. In these situations, the woman cannot be freed. For example, if the husband's brother is under the age of bar mitzvah, the widow has to wait until he reaches the age of 13 when he has the halachic capacity to perform the chalitza ceremony. Imagine, Susan, if you're married to someone who died, but he has a brother who's 3 years old. You have to wait 10 years till you can have that ceremony. Another example is when the husband's brother is not available to participate in the ritual. Let's say he lives on the other side of the world, or you don't even know where he lives. Until he is found, it cannot be done. And then there are even more difficult situations. These are the real tough ones, and actually impossible to solve. If the brother has no legal capacity to perform the act, for example, if he is severely mentally challenged, or if he is deaf, or if he has some physical problem that prevents him from doing the ritual, for example, if his leg is amputated and he cannot wear a shoe or sandal, the widow will be permanently stuck and not allowed to marry again. She's absolutely an aguna.
Rivkah, these cases prove my point that the halacha is more form than function or purpose. If the purpose or function of the halacha is to do justice, or to relieve the suffering of a widow who is tied to an unwanted relationship, the halacha should be able to find a way to help her, even if the brother-in-law happens to be 5 years old or deaf or has an amputated leg. But Rivkah, don't you remember we had a case of a husband with an amputated leg?
Yeah, well,
Remind me what that was about.
It wasn't really our case, but it was a case that I read about in Tchumin, a halachic publication. And I was actually working in Tel Aviv when it was going on, when it was happening in real life. So I knew about it from people talking. So this is a case of a woman who wanted to marry for the third time. She'd been divorced from her first husband and widowed from the second one. She was, I think, in her 70s, and her second husband had no children. Anyway, when she requested permission to marry her third husband, the rabbis figured out and informed her that she needed chalitza from the second husband's brother. She hadn't been in contact with him for many, many years. After searching for him, she discovered that he was diabetic and that his leg had been amputated.
So, Rivkah, you need to expand on why the amputated leg is relevant, even though we mentioned it before, but just review that again for me.
Sure. So the chalitza ceremony requires the widow to take off the brother's sandal or shoe. But the brother, in this case, had no leg. So the rabbis in the Beit Din today debated what to do. If he has no leg, they thought maybe there's no need for chalitza at all. But perhaps it's possible for him to wear the sandal on the other leg. Or they wondered perhaps the brother could wear the sandal at the knee of his amputated leg. It's pretty horrific, the whole story and the whole discussion as it unfolds, how they're going into this. It's hard to read even. The rabbis finally decided that the sandal could be worn on the knee, and they performed the ceremony in that manner. But just to be on the safe side, they also declared that one of the witnesses at the wedding, that is the second husband's wedding, was not kosher.
What do you mean just to be on the safe side? What does that mean, Rivkah?
Because they weren't sure if what they were doing was right and if this chalitza would hold, im zeitfos. They thought that maybe he's not able to do chalitza at all and therefore she's not able to get married, just like if he were deaf or under 13, okay, or if he was incapacitated. So just to be on the safe side, what they were trying to do was retroactively nullify the ceremony of the second husband.
So therefore, she was never really married to her second husband in accordance with Jewish law. And so if she was not married, she really did not need chalitza at all. And then Rivkah, the story that really rings horrifically in my head is the woman who had children via sperm donation. I think you were personally involved with that one, and I'd really like you to tell that story too.
Okay, so this was a very interesting case. I wrote a number of articles many years ago about Ibum and Chalitza that were published online. And at one point I got a phone call from a woman who never actually told me her name, even though we had a lot of conversations. She told me that after reading my article, she suddenly understood that she actually needed to do Chalitza, and she hadn't thought of it before. So she'd been married to a very sick man who couldn't have any children. They decided to do artificial insemination. And because they were religious, they actually went to rabbis at Machon Puah, which is a center for fertility and medicine in accordance with halakha, to get their halachic approval for the artificial insemination. But as you can imagine already, Susan, if they have artificial insemination, the children aren't really the husband's. They're not his biological children. Anyway, she said that they all looked like him, and she was really happy about that. But she also said that this was a huge secret that she and her husband had kept from the children who didn't know that they weren't his biological children. And they kept it from the siblings. I think maybe his parents knew, but that was it. Anyway, when she called me, it was about a year or two after her husband had died, and she said to me the following. She said, listen, I want to go out and meet someone and consider marrying, but this was our secret. It would be desecrating my husband's honor if I let other people in on what he didn't want them to know. If I have to tell even one of my husband's brothers in order to do this ritual, I won't do it. I won't go out and I just won't marry. So she asked me if I could help her in any way.
This is really tragic, Rivkah. The purpose behind the biblical law is supposedly to honor the name of the deceased husband. And in this particular case, the husband was telling you that if she did chalitza, this would dishonor his name.
Right. So to try to find a solution for this woman, I called up a rabbi who worked in the state rabbinic courts. He was an important rabbinic judge. He told me that in order for him to declare that the woman may not need chalitza, she'd have to open a file and bring up the whole story before 3 dayanim, 3 judges. We would need to ask the hospital to waive medical confidentiality in order to obtain the relevant medical documents.
Relating to the artificial insemination.
Right. I went back to the woman and she said, no way, I won't do that. I will not stand in front of a court and open up the issue of my late husband's infertility problems. I ended up consulting with a very knowledgeable rabbi who she agreed to listen to. The rabbi decided that she does not need to do chalitza because it is possible that one of the children, even if it's 1 in a million chance, was actually biologically her husband's. After questioning the woman, the rabbi came to the conclusion that the husband was not 100% infertile and there was some chance that he did have fertile sperm. Then the woman remembered that when the doctors performed the insemination, they tried to take sperm from the husband. I don't know if they did it at Machon Puah or they just got the instructions on how to do it, but they do something where they mix it together and then they always have the benefit of the doubt that perhaps
they mix
the
the husband's sperm.
They mix they mix the husband's sperm with this insemination
donated
thing,
sperm.
the donated sperm. And they always have the benefit of the doubt to think that they were his biological children.
Well, again, we have a happy ending, but one with a convoluted solution to a problematic law. And I wonder what would have happened if the woman had insisted on going to the state rabbinic court for a ruling in the first instance. But I think an interesting lesson to learn from this last case is how important it is to privatize the rabbinic courts. All citizens, like this woman that you helped, should be allowed to choose their own rabbis, whether that rabbi is a Reform rabbi, a Reconstructionist rabbi, a conservative rabbi, a liberal Orthodox rabbi, or a whatever rabbi. The state should not be choosing your rabbis for you.
Okay, I think before we finish, I would like to read a midrash that when we went over this yesterday, you said, yeah, you have a midrash on this, please read it. So I'm going to read it and see if it fits here.
You want to tell us a little bit about what these midrashim are, Rivkah? In what context are they written? They're women's midrashim, correct?
They're women's midrashim, and the idea is that all the midrashim of the rabbis of Chazal were written by men and through the eyes of men, and we want to start having women write about women's topics. So this is based on an article written by Professor Elimelech Vestreich. I'll leave it in the notes to this episode, exactly where it was from. And the name of the article is Family Law Facing the Challenge of Modernity, the Polemic on Yibum Among the Sages of Morocco. And it's a true story. I think that you'll be able to figure out what in it is actually true. By the way, the names are the real names and the story is real, absolutely. I just added in a few things here and there.
I'm just going to add that Rivkah's the star of these women's midrashim. She has quite a few of them, which are very powerful. So we're waiting to hear Rivkah.
Okay. The name of the midrash is Jamila the Objector. It's published in Dir Shuni, Contemporary Women's Midrash, edited by Tamar Bial, and the translation was done by, probably, her husband, Yehuda Mirsky. In Morocco, there was once a great woman named Jamila who rebelled against levirate marriage. A true story. Jamila and her husband, David, lived in peace and tranquility 47 years, and they had no children. When David died, Yamin, his older brother, arose and wished to perform levirate marriage with the wife of the deceased. The rabbinical court told Jamila to enter into levirate marriage with Yamin and uphold the name of the deceased. She told them, I do not want to. I want to perform chalitza and be done with it. They told her, it is accepted by us in this Beit Din that levirate marriage takes precedence over the chalitza ceremony. She said, I shared my bed with David for many years. I do not want to share it with his brother Yamin. The judges said to her, your will is null and void relative to the commandment of levirate marriage. She said to them, what do you want with me? I'm 60 years old and not fit to give birth. They said, how many old and barren women were visited at this age and fit to uphold a name? What's more, they said, the command is obligatory even on those who aren't fit for it. The judges saw that she was steadfast in her refusal, and they rebuked her time and again to make her fulfill the commandment, until she said, I will fulfill the commandment, but with Yaakov, the youngest of the brothers. The judges wondered, what is the difference between Yaakov and Yamin? She said, this is my will, and the will has no reason. The judges returned to Yamin the eldest and said, we will let him decide. Yamin said, let the law pierce the mountain, and I will uphold the name of my dead brother David. In his heart, Yamin said, if I do levirate marriage with her, I will inherit my brother David's estate. Jamila stood her ground and declared, I will not enter into levirate marriage with Yamin. They said to her, my daughter, another version has it, you fool. You will be left without support from the estate and with no dowry, only whatever cash you have on hand. She said to them, I know, but I cannot have relations with someone I loathe. In the end, Jamila was steadfast in her refusal and lived the rest of her days with neither son nor daughter, without support from the estate and with no dowry, aside from whatever cash she had on hand. And this goes to teach how great is the strength of a woman who refuses to have relations with a man she loathes. In the Bet Midrash of women, they said, Jamila was a great woman. Not only did she uphold her own dignity, but the dignity of all daughters of Israel who refused to have relations with men they loathe. Moreover, they said, not only did she uphold the dignity of daughters of Israel who refused to have relations with men they loathe, but also the dignity of the Torah. And people said, Jamila the Great, she had no children, but she made for herself a very great name.
Huh. I love it. But I am prejudiced because I really love all your midrashim, Rivkah, and I think that sums up our episode in the best way possible, sadly. I guess it's time to wrap this up for now. Today we talked about Yibum and Chalitza, levirate marriage, and the renunciation of that marriage tie. Please join us for the second part of this episode on Chalitza. In that episode, we will talk about what's happening now as a result of the war, with many more young widows in need of Chalitza. We will describe how state rabbinic courts are responding, and we will suggest what we at the Center for Women's Justice think can be a solution, or at least a partial one, to the problem. Thank you for listening to our podcast, Justice Unbound, Women, Religion, and the State of Israel, produced by the Center for Women's Justice. We would love to hear your comments and thoughts. Please reach out to us on social media, on Facebook, X, Instagram, or LinkedIn.
This podcast was produced thanks to the generous support of the Gimprich Family Foundation. Thank you, Rachel Stomel, for your help. I am Rivkah Lubitsch.
And I am Susan Weiss. Thank you for listening.